Hi, my name is Dan Burnston, and I'm an associate professor in the philosophy department at Tulane University and an affiliate faculty member at the Tulane Brain Institute. And my project while I'm here at Pitt is about the nature of decision making, specifically as it's revealed in neuroscience. So why should we be interested in decision making? One reason is that it's something that's really familiar and intimate to all of us. We think we understand our decisions, we make dozens of them per day, we explain them to each other, we hold each other accountable for them. So in a sense, it's a really intuitive and fundamental part of our everyday psychology. On the other hand, it's to some degree complicated and mysterious how a complex biological organ like the brain could take in information over multiple timescales, kind of somehow weigh that against my previous experiences and my current situation, and produce a distinct behavior as the outcome of a decision process. So there's a kind of gap between our intuitive and philosophical understandings of decision and what neuroscience dishes up. Now, to some degree, this might be fine in some circumstances, and in philosophy, this has tended to produce a kind of implicit autonomy view, where when philosophers are discussing decision and practical reasoning, they can do that independently of any details about what's going on in the head. And again, in some circumstances that might be fine, but in other circumstances, I think it's inimical to overall understanding of how a decision works. So, for instance, if we look way back, Plato had the analogy of the soul to a charioteer. And the idea here was that the soul, or in modern parlance, we might say the agent, sort of stands back from their body and their emotions and their the details of their situation, and in a sense kind of governs or guides more bodily and emotional processes in the process of making a decision and controlling action. So this view, despite being ancient, I think still shows up in a lot of philosophical contexts. I think it's kind of unacceptably dualistic and kind of needs to be gotten rid of. And thinking more deeply about the neuroscience can help us overcome these kind of maybe false dichotomies or false distinctions between the agent and the agent's brain and body. So the kind of description of decision that I'm working with is stemming entirely from the psychological and neurosciences, and what it delivers or what it offers is a view of the basic kind of decision-making mechanism. So the simplest way to envision this is to imagine kind of the most simple decision you can make. So in a psychophysical experiment, for instance, you might be seeing a field of dots, and dots are moving in different directions, and you have to say which direction are most of the dots moving in, what's the direction of predominant motion. So let's say you're choosing between leftward motion and rightward motion. On the kind of model that I'm thinking of, leftward and rightward will both have a kind of unit inside of your head that is being driven by evidence from the environment. So imagine now you're seeing some movement to the left, that's driving the unit in favor of leftward motion. Now you're seeing some motion to the right, that's driving the unit in favor of rightward motion. And the idea is that these units kind of compete with each other, and the decision process is terminated when you hit a kind of threshold of activation. And now, okay, you've hit the threshold, so I'm going to say, okay, it's rightward motion. So even though this is really simple, it gives a lot of resources for thinking about the nature of the decision process. You can modify these models depending on the number of choices, on whether the choices are in one stage or in a sequence of stages. And these models can produce really fine-grained predictions about the probability of choices in certain evidential situations and the reaction time, the time that choices will take. So not only that, but they're also very neurally plausible. So you can think of these units I described as basically populations of neurons that are inhibiting each other, competing with each other, and then whichever one crosses the threshold of activation first will guide the action. So again, these are really simple models, but it turns out they're extremely powerful. They describe these kinds of perceptual decisions, not just in humans, but also in rodents and primates. Not only do they describe perceptual decisions, but very importantly, they extend across decision types. So the biggest advance in this field in the last 10 years is thinking about not just perceptual decisions, but choices and value-based decisions in terms of this basic kind of competitive process. So the idea here is instead of being driven by external evidence, in a value-based decision, the decision is being driven by internal evidence, and that evidence is basically what my expectation of the biggest reward will be when I'm making a decision for A or B. Not only that, but it also extends to even more broad decisions. So for instance, if I'm debating how much effort to put into a problem versus the likelihood of solving that problem, say a math problem, then you can also model that situation with this very basic kind of decision-making mechanism. So what we have here is a really powerful modeling framework that's very neurally plausible for how we think about decisions. And indeed, in neuroscience, this has become the standard story about how decision works and applied in many different decision-making contexts. So, but now we're left again at this gap, right? So here's the kind of mechanism that neuroscience says is underlying decisions. You notice in this description, there's nothing about reasons, there's nothing about goals per se, right? It's kind of a very stripped down view of the mechanism. So now we're left with this question of how to bridge, assuming this is the right kind of model, this very basic neuroscientific mechanism to all the complex things that I started out mentioning at the beginning. So my project is in kind of trying to draw these two different styles of description together. So how do these basic decision-making mechanisms relate to our everyday practices of intuiting our own decisions, describing our own decisions? How does it relate to the experience of acting and deciding? Moreover, how, on the more scientific side, how does this kind of basic model extend to things like decisions over a long period of time, or really kind of self-involving decisions like do I become a lawyer or a doctor? So my project is to first kind of interpret these models in a philosophical way, and then to try to start to, what we would say, scale them up to more complex everyday decision making, and then use them to help us do better philosophy of action and agency. For instance, by helping us collapse this outdated kind of charioteer view, by helping us further understand the dynamics of our action, the dynamic experience of acting, and so on. So my goal here is really a neuroscientifically inspired model of decision and agency in action, and I want to use this to help us do or give better philosophical accounts of acting and agency.